Speaker.
Order.
Item 2, Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Bill, second reading.
Leader.
Mr. Speaker, may I seek your consent and the general assent of members present to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 to remove the time limit in respect of Minister Shanmugam's speeches.
I give my consent. Does the Leader of the House have the general assent of honourable members present to so move? Aye. Leader, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 in respect of Minister Shanmugam's speeches.
The question is, as moved by the Leader of the House, as many as are of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Minister for Law.
You've got good eyesight. Thank you, sir. As I start, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, may I ask the clerks to distribute the handouts?
Please do.
While they are being distributed, I'll start. So this bill comes after a long process of public consultation, beginning on the 5th of January last year. Green paper by my Ministry of Law, as well as Ministry of Communications and Information, highlighted the serious nature of the issues, the significant impact in other countries, and on the 5th of January we asked Parliament, and Parliament did so appoint a select committee to examine 4 broad issues. The select committee, which I will call SC, then held public hearings, received 169 written representations from a broad cross-section of society. The SC then prepared a detailed 279-page report. Many of the issues which have been raised since the bill was first tabled in Parliament repeat the points that were canvassed quite extensively during the SC hearings. Points like falsehoods, how to define them, how to differentiate from opinions, the possible different decision-making models like executive powers, independent body, courts, and other such points. Some of the discussions since the bill has been tabled, I think, have not considered what the SC has said or the evidence that has been presented and the balancing between the different interests that the SC had to do. I hope the discussions in this House will be better informed by reference to the Select Committee's report. So in this speech, I will first explain the existing powers in law for dealing with objectionable material and contrast that with the powers under the bill. Second, why the bill is being brought before this House now. And third, the need and rationale for the bill. Fourth, new media and the weaponization of falsehoods. And fifth, deal with some of the concerns that have been expressed. And finally, conclude. My colleagues, Ministers Ishwaran, Edwin Tong, will deal with the key provisions of the bill and how they implement the Select Committee's recommendations. Minister Ong Ye Kung will speak on the universities, and my colleagues Zaki and San Shui Ling will also speak in addition to other MPs. First, the powers that the government has under existing legislation. They are wider than what is proposed under this bill. As we consider the bill, the first question is, what are the government's powers under existing legislation? And what can the government do about objectionable material now? In essential respects, existing powers are wider than those proposed under the bill. Let me return to the current legislation, can refer to the Broadcasting Act, the Telecoms Act, various other pieces of legislation. Collectively, they give the following powers. They allow orders to be made for takedown of any material that's objectionable on grounds of public interest. The statements do not have to be factual or false. They can be true, they can be opinions, they can nevertheless be taken down, ordered to be taken down under the current law. 2, current laws also criminalize the transmission of false or fabricated messages, including on the internet. Licensed newspapers, broadcasters, including on the internet, can be required to carry clarifications, other content. The ministers can order to restrict financing, technical support to offending websites and restrict their reach, can block offending websites and access to objectionable material. Section 16 of the Broadcasting Act allows IMDA to direct a broadcasting licensee to take such action with regard to content as it considers necessary to comply with the Act. Some of these powers have existed since the 1960s. Others were added on subsequently with development of technology. Laws have been updated. Many of these powers also apply to online material. The Internet revolution took off in the 1990s. 1996, the class licensing scheme under the Broadcasting Act for Internet content providers was put in. The Internet content providers, ICPs, are automatically licensed. All have to comply with guidelines under the class license conditions and the Internet Code of Practice. IMDA has power to take down content that goes against, and I quote, public interest, public order, national harmony, amongst other grounds. 2013, then MDA put in place a new individual licensing scheme for news websites which report regularly on Singapore. Also required online news sites to remove within 24 hours content which was in breach of standards and posted a performance bond of $50,000. The new regime harmonized the legal framework for online news sites with the framework for traditional news providers. At that point in 2013, members will recall some persons created the Hands Off My Internet movement, Free My Internet rally in Hong Lim. Some painted doomsday scenarios, there are going to be a chilling effect on free speech, death of free speech, and so on. And online statements were circulated to take a strong stand against the licensing regime, online petition as well. All of that had little to do with the truth. Prior to the 2013 regulations, online news sites already had to comply with the same content standards. So there was no change in content standards. Post-2013, discussions online carried on as before. So from 1996 to 2019, or the 23 years that you have had the class licensing scheme, takedowns were used mostly for sites and services with pornographic content, solicitation of sex, sex chats, religiously offensive content, extremist content. Most people in the street don't even know of the BA or other legislation and no impact on what they have been saying. The powers under the BA have been used judiciously and discussions have carried on as before. The arguments made in 2013 against the changes are similar to the arguments that are being made now, and I will explain that later. They also have no connection to reality. I will now make the point that the bill provides for a narrower set of powers compared with powers that the government already has. This is an important point when we make philosophical arguments in this House. Earlier, I sketched out existing powers, and I've said the bill is narrower in essential respects because it only applies to false statements of fact, and in addition, it must be shown that the falsehoods are against public interest, which is set out in some detail in the bill. The four aspects of the bill that have been commented upon by those who are opposed: takedown of material, takedown can be ordered by ministers, definition of public interest, definition of falsehoods. I'll deal quickly with all four. Current position, if you compare the first point, the BA is broader on the types of material that can be taken down. The bill is narrower. IMDA can direct licensees to remove content. It has the power to impose further obligations on licensees through the licensing conditions to correct falsehoods or shut down fake accounts. IMDA can also require a licensee to carry any correction as directed. Second point, powers under the BA exercised by a minister today, and there is no direct appeal to the court. It's only by judicial review. The third point, public interest. Definition under the current law is wider, and the grounds for taking action are also broader. Any statement, whether true or false, factual or opinion, if it's objectionable against public interest, national harmony, can be ordered to be taken down, subject to judicial review. Bill is much narrower. Fourth point, falsehoods. How do you define? Dealing with falsehoods is not new. Section 45 of the Telecoms Act criminalizes falsehoods transmitted over the internet and other modes. And courts have long had to deal with the question of falsehoods in the law of torts, contracts, criminal law. Section 45 of the TA was repealed yesterday, subsumed under the MOA and the Penal Code, and the relevant provision on transmitting falsehoods is now under Section 14D of the MOA without any change. It's just been transported over. So some of the discussions by those opposed to this bill fails to consider what the SC report has said and seems to be without an understanding of the existing position. Let me now deal with the second point. It's not just narrower in scope, but it also gives greater judicial oversight compared to the current law. Existing powers on takedown of objectionable material, the government responses to be carried, other orders to be made. What oversight does the court have today? It's by judicial review. POFMA, the bill, on the determination of falsehoods, the court oversight is by way of direct appeal. And that was a considered decision by the government. And the process will be made fast and inexpensive for individuals. Other exercise of government powers under the bill, judicial review will be available, as is the law now. So whatever concerns there are about the bill, they cannot logically have been increased by this bill. And lawyers will know when you have a narrower bill and the facts come within the narrower bill as opposed to the broader law, in general, the narrower act will apply. So in fact, that represents a narrowing of the current position. So as members speak, I hope the debate will be based on an understanding of the current position. And I'll do that by putting a series of questions. Does the current law already criminalize transmission of falsehoods? Answer is yes. Does the bill take a narrower position? Answer is yes. So these arguments about definition of fact, these concerns cannot be new. We have had similar provisions all this while with less judicial oversight. So how does the bill increase the concerns? Second, takedowns, corrections. Are they possible now? Answer is yes. Third, can a minister order takedown now? Answer is yes. Fourth, can a minister order takedowns on broader grounds than under the bill? Answer is yes. Fifth, does the bill give greater judicial oversight? Answer is yes. So having said that, members can then ask, if the powers are narrower in essential respects, why is the government introducing this legislation? Why not just rely on existing legislation? The existing legislation with broad powers has been in place for some time, or have been in place for some time. After the SC process, we decided, let's have new legislation with a narrower set of powers than under existing legislation, focused on online falsehoods, with remedies that are more calibrated and provide for greater judicial oversight over executive action. It's designed specifically for the Internet rather than rely on existing legislation, and to deal specifically with online falsehoods rather than the broader areas that are covered under the BA. An alternate approach was entirely possible, which would be to rely on existing legislation with slight tweaks and add subsidiary legislation. If we relied on existing legislation, what we want to achieve under this bill can be achieved as follows. First, rely on the BA, Broadcasting Act, as it is now, for correction directions, takedown directions, general correction directions, and demonetization to some extent. Section 16 of the BA allows IMDA to direct a licensee to take such action with regard to content as it considers necessary to comply with the Act. So that would be the BA. And then you have subsidy legislation under the BA, which can be passed with account restriction directions, declaration of online location, advertising levers. Then you move on to the existing class licensing scheme, can also be amended through subsidy legislation to cover provision of content by individual publishers and clarify that Internet intermediaries like Facebook and Google are also covered. So all of this could have been done under subsidy legislation. The only thing that would have required a statutory amendment would have been one point under the Broadcasting Act to the territoriality provision to include Internet intermediaries based outside of Singapore. But that really is not in dispute. I don't think anybody in this House will say we shouldn't cover Internet intermediaries based outside Singapore. If we had taken this alternate approach, the powers would be broad and there would be less judicial oversight. Issues that have been raised, fact versus falsehoods, public interest, ministerial action, all, there would be no amendments needed for the legislation. Can rely on existing legislation. Members can therefore see, if we had relied on existing legislation with appropriate amendments, and if you map that against issues that have been raised in public, fact versus falsehoods, public interest, ministerial action to take down, there would have been no need to amend. If we had taken that approach, the result would have been an instrument with none of the calibration that the bill proposes or the extent of judicial oversight, which is also going to be made speedier under the current proposals. So the BA was essential at its time to achieve the objective of that Act. It provides a balanced framework applicable to all forms of broadcast content. The bill, on the other hand, was fashioned to deal specifically with falsehoods that can be spread online with incredible speed in a targeted manner, and to address such falsehoods with speed, with proportionality, and with the courts given greater powers. That is why the bill is preferable. That explains the background. What is the need and the rationale for the bill? What are the substantive reasons for the bill? To understand that, we need to look at this larger context. Trends around the world affecting the very foundations of democracy, seriously impacting on societies, affecting the free flow of ideas, honest discussions, and strangling the marketplace of ideas. This bill is an attempt to deal with some of these very real, serious risks which all societies face, but at the same time, in a carefully considered manner, with the government deciding that we should come before the House and put forward something that, in a way, cuts down on the existing powers and put forward a new bill that actually restricts the government's powers compared with today, but focused on online falsehoods. And voluntarily, compared with existing legislation, saying, if the House agrees, let's give greater oversight to the judges. And let's make it much faster. So that is the true nature of the exercise. But the bill is not a silver bullet. It cannot address all the issues. And I'll ask members to bear with me as I set this out, because it is important for both members and the public to understand the larger picture before we can understand why this bill is necessary. The Select Committee dealt with a part of the issue, but if you take one step back, what is the fundamental problem in many countries today? It's really a serious loss of trust in governments, in institutions, which are both public and private, including the political system, the media, the professions, businesses, financial institutions, and so on. What is the reason for the loss of trust? Several factors. I will mention four. First, inequality and inequity. Second, political systems not delivering. These developments have been aided by two other factors, at least two other factors. The way traditional media has been behaving, and second, effect of new media. This loss of trust in turn has led to destructive populism in many countries with serious consequences for democracies. Now, I will ask members to bear with me as I explain each, because what we are facing is a very serious situation across the world, and we will face it. And this is not something to be taken lightly. I think the very seriousness of what we are facing, what many other countries in the world are facing, has to be understood to see not just this legislation, but everything that we're going to do as a parliament, as a government, as a society hereafter, has got to be seen in the context of what is happening. First, trust. Trust in institutions is important for society's well-being and prosperity. Institutions that deliver public goods for society, the executive, the parliament, the courts, army, police, and other institutions like the media, healthcare system, banks, professions, universities. Institutions are the building blocks of democratic societies. People depend on institutions to deliver economic and societal benefits. Institutions play a crucial stabilizing role. They serve to manage diversity, hold communities together, keep extremist politics at bay. Institutions, in turn, depend on trust and legitimacy to work, to persuade the public to make sacrifices for the common good, and to encourage societies to cooperate and come together to solve problems, to implement policies successfully, to take action for society's benefit, and to steer countries through crises. When people lose trust in institutions, that creates a vicious cycle. Studies show, for example, low trust in the medical system has an impact on the public health, management of other disease outbreaks. Take law enforcement. Perceived legitimacy of police is crucial to effective law enforcement. You can give examples in all sectors. But basic point, when trust in institutions is lost, society suffers, everyone suffers. What's the situation in the West, in many countries? In Western democracies, trust in government is falling significantly. In Europe, percentage of Europeans who trust their national governments has fallen from 36% to 29% over the last 10 years. Decline nearly in all countries of Europe. In the US, Research Center study shows public trust at near historic lows. In 2019, only 17% trust the government. Percentage of Americans with a great deal of confidence in courts, 16%. 45% do not have much confidence. In the presidency, 19%. 54% don't have much confidence. Americans have the least confidence in Congress, their parliament. 8% have a great deal of confidence, 71% not much confidence. Trust in other public institutions is also falling. In media, medical profession, legal profession, many others. And it's all borne out by data. Singapore, in comparison, so far is okay. We were first included in the Edelman Trust Barometer in 2011. Trust in government has been good. we are in the top trust category, and the government is the most trusted institution in Singapore. Trust in government in 2019 was at 67, compared with the global average of 26 countries at 47. Trust in mainstream media, we are 7th out of 26 countries. But we cannot ignore the global risks. And we are likely to be impacted by the same forces. Loss of trust in America has been described by the Wall Street Journal as not merely a problem, but a crisis. It speaks to a loss of trust in the political system as a whole and in democracy itself. What has led to this loss of trust? I highlighted 4 factors among several. Let me touch on them briefly. First, rising inequality, inequity in many parts of the world. If you take the US, the top 0.1% of US households hold the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90%. In US, the average salary of a CEO is 354 times the average salary of a worker. In UK, on the eve of Brexit, UK reached its wealthiest position in modern history. Yet in the previous 2 years, the poorest 20% of UK households' overall wealth declined by 9%. It's a global problem. 70% of people live in a country that has seen a rise in inequality in the last 30 years. By 2030, it's estimated that the richest 1% could own 2/3 of the global wealth. So that's one part, inequality. It's a very serious issue. And it is an issue in Singapore as well. Second, political systems not delivering. In absolute terms, living standards in most countries have risen compared with previous generations. But absolute numbers are just one part of the picture. You have to look at the reality of people's lives. People's lives are not improving. 3 indicators amongst many: social mobility, quality of public education, jobs. Social mobility in the world's richest countries has stalled since the 1990s. As of 2018, just a couple of examples. In the UK, it took 5 generations or 150 years for a child from the bottom 10% in terms of income to reach the national average income. In France and Germany, it took 6 generations, 180 years. In the US, the public education system, the serious deficiencies have been documented, and low investments in public education is one reason for lower social mobility. So people lose faith in democracy as a whole. People give up. They give up on governments. They don't think governments can deliver. So US, Australia, UK, Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, other countries. Percentage of people who say it is essential to live in a democracy has fallen significantly, especially amongst the young. Less than 1/3 of Americans below the age of 35, less than 1/3, say it is absolutely important to live in a democracy. From 1995 to 2017, the share of French, Germans, Italians who favored military rule went up 3 times. From 1995 to 2014, the share of Americans who favored military rule rose 2.5 times, from 1 in 16 to 1 in 6. Imagine that, 1 in 6 in America. So the desire for upending the status quo has serious consequences, destabilization, global effects. Democracy itself is under serious threat. It will be very unwise for us to watch and do nothing, because it can sweep us over very quickly. I believe we are at one of those crucial turning points in history. It's not quite Götterdämmerung, but a turn for the worse. This weakening of democracy and institutions has been powered by a series of contributing factors. And I'll mention 2, media and new media. First, the media. Media has in other countries played a highly corrosive role in eroding trust in many ways. In Australia, media played a major role in the ousting of former Australian Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. Media attacked Turnbull savagely and regularly because the media owner didn't agree with Turnbull government's policies, in particular on climate change, and media became an active participant in politics and decided outcomes. As he was being ousted, Turnbull said, and I quote, "The reality is that a minority in the party room, supported by others outside Parliament, have sought to bully, intimidate others into making this change of leadership that they are seeking." Kevin Rudd, another former Prime Minister, was also ousted by the media. He wrote a scathing article, and he said Murdoch ran a campaign to destroy his government in the 2013 elections, Murdoch's papers began to attack Rudd because Rudd planned to build a national broadband network that would be good for Australia, but Murdoch's cable monopoly would face greater competition. So Rudd was ousted. Rudd described Murdoch as the greatest cancer of the Australian democracy. And I quote, "A political bully and thug who for many years has hired bullies as his editors, the message to Australian politicians is clear. Either toe the line on what Murdoch wants, or he kills you politically." He described, I quote, "a cowering, fearful political culture across the country, fear of personal repercussions if you challenge Murdoch's interests," and said that Murdoch's print media had a disproportionate impact on setting the day's overall agenda, using a masterful conflation of opinion with news. Such media environment, of course, erodes trust in government. If you look at Britain, the baleful influence of media in British politics is well documented. Look at a Guardian report in 2011. It said Blair paid court to Murdoch, securing Murdoch's patronage. Murdoch gave Blair the power to shut out detractors, used his newspapers to help Blair beat down his rival Brown. Brown, on the other hand, used Daily Mail as a platform. When Murdoch was opposed to the EU, when asked why, Murdoch reportedly said, "When I go to Downing Street, they do what I say. When I go to Brussels, they take no notice." Murdoch has since denied saying it, but the city editor of the Times, Hilton, has stood by his account of what Murdoch said to him. Kevin Rudd made the point that Murdoch made Brexit possible because of the position taken by his papers. Not just Murdoch's papers, others as well. And with your permission, Mr. Speaker, may I display some slides on the LED screens. Stephen Barnett is a prominent parliamentary advisor and professor of communications in the UK. Said in the lead up to the June 23rd EU referendum, British mainstream media failed spectacularly, led inevitably by the viscerally anti-EU Daily Mail, Sun, Daily Express, Telegraph. Most of Britain's national press indulged in little more than a catalogue of distortions, half-truths, outright lies. It was a ferocious propaganda campaign in which facts, sober analysis, sacrificed to the ideologically driven objectives of editors and other proprietors. The pro-Leave camp in UK, the Daily Mail, Daily Express, the Sun, the Daily Telegraph, combined readership of 28 million, used sensational headlines, outright lies. Sunday Express, 12 million Turks would move to the UK, a complete falsehood. If Turkey joined the EU, later admitted it was inaccurate. Government on one side, people on the other, media is the intermediary, and with the media regularly trade in lies to attack the government without basis, this happens. Trust in government goes down, institutions will be severely damaged. And the media can destroy institutions. Example of a great institution that has been savaged is the UK courts. Among the best in the world. I've spoken about this in the House previously. I do not wish to go into it, but I have in the attachment set out how the British media have severely damaged the British judiciary. So traditional media holds power over society's information. It has the ability to influence minds and viewpoints. When the media acts responsibly, it serves democracy. When they do not, it damages democracy. So in many countries, traditional media has played a big role in the loss of trust. I spoke about inequality, inequity, political systems not delivering, media abusing its power, new media being abused. I've sketched out the first three. New media is the subject of this bill. I'll come back to it and deal with it in greater detail. But let me first complete the larger point on the consequences of the four aspects coming together. Members can then see what happens when you don't deal with these very real dangers, or very real danger of these developments. In an active democracy, the foundations include trust, free speech, and an infrastructure of fact. The four elements I referred to have combined like a battering ram to damage, destroy these foundations. When people lose trust, when they lose faith, when there is no proper public discourse, when infrastructure of fact is damaged, then democracies, societies are at serious risk. Populism will then rise, violence will rise, particularly towards the minorities, the weak. Ability of countries to face challenges will be weakened. The crisis of trust in many countries has opened wide the doors to dangerous, destructive politics. Populism. Populism both exploits and deepens the loss of faith in the system, making it harder for institutions to correct and to find solutions. Gallup has said, when people hold, and I quote, low trust in government and low or static expectations for their future lives, support for populist, anti-establishment policies increases. Politics that can and has in some countries destroyed democracy and replaced it with corruption. The 2017 Edelman Trust Barometer drew a direct link between the lack of trust in public institutions and these populist movements. 44% of those who voted to leave the EU believed the system was failing and held fears about at least one major societal issue, compared with 20% of those who wanted to remain in the EU. Populists use these fears as ammunition to feed the crisis of trust in institutions, and 2016 saw populist movements make major gains. The Eurasia Group has said populism is a force in US politics, and in Europe, populist political parties are getting close to or are in government positions in several countries. Populism also reigns in some Latin American countries and has gained footholds in Asia. And the assessment by the Eurasia Group is populism is likely to intensify and spread over the coming decade, weakening governments, delegitimizing political leaders as a consequence. The result will be a set of unyielding centrifugal forces, creating a global environment described by the Eurasia Group as the most dangerous it has been in decades. This is the serious situation that faces many countries, and we will face it as well. That is why I referred to Gattadamaram earlier. Many issues, right? Inequality, inequity, political systems failing to deliver traditional media, new media, the impact leading to loss of trust and to populism. We have to avoid this trajectory, means we have to deal with each of these issues. This bill is an attempt to deal with one part of the problem. The serious problems arising from falsehoods spread through new media, and to try and help support the infrastructure of fact and promote honest speech in public discourse. It is an important part, even as we work on other aspects. Now I turn to falsehoods and new media. Many societies, including ours, are pluralistic and diverse, with competing interests and identities, with religious diversity as well. Various interest groups, NGOs, other associations are there. Each pursues its interests, causes, and passions. Such diversity is never easy to navigate. It can give rise to instability and conflict. James Madison, one of the American founding fathers, argues that the factions in a diverse society cannot be controlled. Only the effects of such factions can be countered. Decision-making with diversity is not always easy, and a key foundation of democracy is public discourse. Ideally, public discourse will help citizens understand complex policy issues. It will guide policymakers to make optimal decisions. It will shape differing viewpoints and expand common ground. But public discourse can only take place when there is free and responsible speech. The prerequisites for national conversations are a common vocabulary, an underpinning of facts, and that provides a platform for accommodation and compromise amongst diverse voices in society. A critical piece of infrastructure in these conversations is fact, and the infrastructure of fact. Like public infrastructure, society depends on it. It provides society with a shared reality This is necessary so that we can have diversity without conflict and public participation while still getting decisions made. Without it, our political system will malfunction. William Davis, the English sociologist and political economist, has said, and I quote, "The fact that millions of people are able to believe the same things about reality is a remarkable achievement, but one that is more fragile than is often recognized." A critical reason for this remarkable achievement, and I quote Davis again, is something so ubiquitous, so ordinary, that we scarcely ever stop to notice it: trust. This is the trust that when public institutions, the government, media, other institutions, share a piece of information with the public, they do so honestly. Trust in public institutions is a cornerstone of the infrastructure of fact. The belief in the authenticity of the source, whether it be the media, the government, experts, other authoritative sources, makes society accept facts. Authenticity, of course, has to be earned and maintained. And if an usually trusted source is not telling the truth, there must be avenues to expose, and there must be consequences. So that rigor helps in maintaining authenticity. People will then believe if it is said, it is likely to be true, and if it is not true, it will be exposed. These are amongst the foundations on which modern societies are based. They are bigger than the government of the day. They are bigger than any political party. This is about the basic structure of society. New media has been heavily exploited to batter this infrastructure of fact, which in turn weakens trust in public discourse, in institutions, in democracy itself. I will now set out how falsehoods have been weaponized to attack the infrastructure of fact, to destroy trust, and to attack societies. New media is an information superhighway. It's got many byways, links to different groups, and to everyone. It has now been used to send out, on an industrial scale, falsehoods to mislead people. Broad sections targeted, but also specific groups and individuals are targeted. The attack using falsehoods on social media comes from several directions, several sources. One, foreign countries using information warfare. Two, profit-driven actors. Three, deliberate actors for political ends. And four, people with prejudices seeking to harm other groups. Select Committee noted this. So let's look at some sources of falsehoods. First, foreign countries. This is a military doctrine has been developed for the internet age. General Gerasimov, the Russia's military chief of staff, there is a doctrine named after him called the Gerasimov Doctrine. Basically, he says, rules of war have changed. Non-military measures, including information operations, they can be harnessed to, in turn, harness what he calls the protest potential of the population. What does it mean? Information operations can target and create internal opposition as a permanently operating front throughout the target country. And these non-kinetic military measures, in many cases, can exceed the power, as this doctrine says, the power of force and weapons. Even though military or overt violent measures are not being used, the target state's national sovereignty, security are threatened and violated. In this way, the line between war and peace have now blurred, and wars no longer have to be declared. Security experts gave evidence to the Select Committee. Dr. Shashi Jayakumar said, in modern information warfare, and I quote, seeding internal opposition within the target country is extremely important. And he said that technological tsunami has given aggressor states the ability to subvert individual slices of the target country in a manner unthinkable just 2 to 3 decades ago. A national security expert from Latvia, Dr. Berzin, said, "The notion of a broken social contract is the main vulnerability exploited by foreign adversaries." In his words, it is easier for the adversary to achieve its objectives if the society of the state being attacked believes that their country is a failed state that does not care for the interests and needs of the population, and the loss of current statehood will bring better living conditions. Singapore is a specific and vulnerable target for some very precise reasons. It has military superiority in this region, and experts said this. That superiority in conventional forces means it will be futile to start a war with Singapore. And therefore, militarily weaker countries will then focus on other means to weaken Singapore, sap our will from inside, create deep internal divisions, and keep us in a permanent state of internal dissension. And the evidence is that this is already happening. The Selectcom heard it. We know it is happening, even though we don't come out in public and say it very openly. It's happening to sap people's support for the SAF, for defense, to try and shift Singapore's foreign policy as well. And these are not issues that we should dismiss lightly. Just assuming we go on the basis of the evidence that was presented at the Select Committee, it has happened elsewhere. And I'll give you some evidence of how it has happened. Take Ukraine, a foreign country which the Select Committee didn't really name, used falsehoods to build a narrative that the Ukrainian government was fascist and corrupt. It spread online falsehoods about atrocities being carried out against a particular community in Ukraine. For example, that Ukrainian soldiers had crucified a child, which was later debunked. Volunteers who fought against Ukraine said they were motivated because of these supposed atrocities. Consequences: loss of sovereignty, part of territory, loss of lives. If you take the Czech Republic, disinformation operation by a foreign country was used to turn domestic sentiments in favor of the foreign state's geopolitical goals. One objective was to make people believe that the US was responsible for the influx of Syrian refugees into Europe and the conflict in Ukraine. The disinformation appears to have had some impact. 2016, 50.2% of Czechs believed that the US is responsible for Syrian refugees coming to Europe. 38% believed that the Ukrainian crisis was caused by the US and NATO. So it was done to weaken the Czech support for NATO and Ukraine. Take Germany. If it can happen in the UK and if it can happen in Germany, I think it can easily happen here. A girl fabricated a claim that she had been assaulted by 3 Middle Eastern migrants. Foreign media outlets reported on that widely, suggesting it was true, specifically from one country. Reports were then spread on social media. Berlin authorities investigated, confirmed the girl's claim had been fabricated. But the falsehoods were circulated online that the police had failed to follow up on the case. Thousands demonstrated on the streets to expose the government's attempts to cover up the crimes perpetrated by the refugees. That same year, a far-right populist party made unprecedented gains in the regional elections, and most of its support came from the same minority constituency as the girl who made the rape claims. Sweden, the Swedish Defense Agency, says false information about subjects such as NATO, immigration, terrorism are spread on a daily basis in Sweden. Many of these countries, trust is being eroded in institutions, populism is on the rise. Since Russia's name had come up in the media, the Select Committee invited Russia to help us, and the Russian embassy very helpfully sent us a letter that Russia is also very concerned about fake news and has been the victim of fake news. So we had no doubt that Russia takes this matter very seriously. Now, next, apart from foreign state actors, commercial profit, another dimension. Digital advertising models have turned websites into virtual real estate. So value depends on the attention attracted. With every click, every view, digital ad revenue is earned. This business model has created an attention economy, content that stokes fear and anger, and good for attracting attention. Falsehoods can help people earn large sums of money and have political impact. In the US, an American named Paul Horner, he set up at least 20 fake news websites. Some used deceptive URLs, and it tricked readers into thinking that they were mainstream sources like ABC News, CNN. He was prolific. He used his websites to publish fake stories, stoke partisan engagement, claimed that they were satirical, said he assumed people will fact-check. But many did not, and they were fooled. Some examples of his falsehoods. During a government shutdown, President Obama used his own money to keep open a government-funded Muslim culture museum. Fox News reported that as a fact before retracting it. False article, protesters were paid to protest against Mr. Trump, retweeted by the Trump campaign. 20 million Amish people had committed to vote for Mr. Trump, turned up in Google News, had 750,000 page views in 2 days. He made $10,000 a month from Google AdSense. He was opposed to President Trump, but targeted conservatives with his fake stories because he found it more profitable. A BuzzFeed News investigation found a network of at least 43 websites which together published more than 750 fake news articles. A small study. All of them used Google AdSense to earn digital advertising revenue. Towards the end of the 2016 US presidential elections, a small town in Macedonia became well known, registered home to at least 100 pro-Trump websites, filled with sensational falsehoods. Macedonians experimented with different targeted audiences. Fake stories could gain the most traction among Trump supporters, they found. Sometimes they wrote their own articles, but often would just reuse falsehoods from alternate right websites in the US. In the 4 months leading up to the elections, one young Macedonian earned nearly US $16,000 from 2 websites he ran. For 5 or 6 hours of work, he could earn about $1,000 a month. So as Samanth Subramaniam, a reporter with Wired, said, and I quote, "This is the disturbing heart of the affair, that the internet made it so simple for these young men to finance their material whims, and that their actions helped deliver such momentous consequences." Third category, deliberate individual actors. You had foreign state actors, you have people doing it for money, now people who do it deliberately, and groups. The SC found that in several countries, both local and foreign civilians had spread falsehoods for political causes, affecting both their own countries and other countries as well. Example, again, far-right nationalist groups promoting more extreme politics. Domestic alt-right in the US used falsehoods, drove major false narratives during the 2016 US presidential elections. More recently, in 2018, Brazilian presidential elections, local far-right groups, coordinated network of fake social media accounts, spread misinformation in support of right-wing candidates. Populists use lines to attack institutions, invoke divisive rhetoric. They use conspiracy theories to explain complex issues in simple terms and trying to make people believe them. Truth then becomes completely irrelevant. Even the most extreme lies, which we might think people will normally dismiss, becomes believed and impacts very badly on public life. So British historian, journalist Anne Applebaum said this about populist movements, and I quote, "They don't require belief in a full-blown ideology. Most of them don't deploy propaganda that conflicts with everyday reality, and yet all of them encouraged their followers to engage, at least part of the time, with an alternative reality. In UK, falsehoods were spread extensively during the EU referendum. Immigration was a key issue. I spoke earlier about false claims in traditional media about Turks, Turkey, and Brexit. Digital advertisements were also run by the Leave EU campaign that Turkey was joining the EU. 12 million Turks would, in that event, move to the UK if it remained in the EU. Foreign interference was also at play. Fake foreign-linked accounts posted more than 45,000 messages about Brexit in the 48 hours during the referendum. A large part of the foreign-linked content related to refugees, immigration, false stories, stories of illegal migrants attacking women, concocted. But these falsehoods were used to create an alternative reality. If you believed them, you would believe there was a conspiracy by the ruling elite to turn the UK and Europe into a Muslim caliphate. Muslims were campaigning for Sharia law to govern the UK. Mayor of London, a Muslim, was sponsoring them. And in the UK, there are areas where Sharia law dominates and non-Muslims cannot enter. Sounds outlandish. Who will believe? The British are very sensible people, but even the British fell for it. In 2018, YouGov did a survey of over 10,000 people, so it was a substantial survey. 32% believe the falsehood about no-go areas under Sharia law in the UK. 49% of those who voted to leave the EU stated that this was true. It also created a permissive environment for hate. In the month after the referendum, there was a 41% spike in hate crimes, and the majority of the crimes were motivated by race, including crimes against migrants. Brexit altered the course of British history. It's one of the most important events in their recent history, and massive falsehood campaign. It may well have affected the outcome. An investigative report in The Guardian by a British journalist, Carolyn Cadwallader, explained. She went to a town in Wales that probably received more money, more EU funds than any other town, and still voted to leave the EU. 62% of them voted to leave. In this town, the EU was funding a £350 million regeneration project, a £33 million college for further education, which had 29,000 apprenticeships for young people to learn a trade, a £77 million road improvement scheme, and a £30 million railway line. The town had one of the lowest immigration rates in the country. It was in Wales, which was a net EU beneficiary. But when Caroline interviewed the people in the town, she discovered the existence of an alternative reality. People believed the town was sending more money to the EU than it was receiving. The EU had not only done nothing for the town, it had also brought a huge immigration problem, including from Turkey. The Welsh town had been a left-wing Labour stronghold. Yet the people were repeating information usually found in right-wing newspapers. She discovered that they were getting the information or misinformation from targeted digital ads on Facebook. One of the most controversial claims in the UK during the referendum was that the UK sends £350 million a week to the EU, not only plastered on buses, but also run as digital ads aimed at specific groups of voters. The UK Stats Authority said the figure was likely closer to £136 million per week. Despite the corrections, a 2018 King's College London study showed 42% of the people who had heard this claim believed it to be true, and 22% were unsure. Only 30% correctly believed that it was false. For a referendum that may have irreversibly altered the course of British history, these are serious consequences. In the US as well, falsehoods and lies have been spread on a massive scale. A study from Stanford University shows that on average, each American adult read about 3 false stories in the months leading up to the 2016 US elections. And the researchers compiled the fake stories that had been debunked by fact-checking websites. Found that these falsehoods were shared about 38 million times, leading to around 760 million engagements with the content. And the false narratives were driven by people who identified with the homegrown alternate right movement. Largely sought to denigrate the establishment, attack Mrs. Clinton's campaign, also at play sophisticated foreign information campaign that sought to influence the outcome, undermine democratic institutions, and the democratic ideals. So there was the conspiracy theory that Mrs. Clinton and other top Democrats were part of a child pedophilia ring operating out of a Pizza Hut in Washington, D.C. Sounds completely crazy. Utterly unbelievable if you think about it. The rumors began on Twitter, spread to other websites and online forums. Claims got louder. Hacked emails from Mrs. Clinton's campaign were distorted to support the conspiracy theory. An American man showed up at the pizza restaurant to self-investigate, and he brought a gun along with him. People demonstrated in front of the White House, declaring that the theory was real. The falsehoods helped create an alternate reality, one where a deep state existed within the U.S. institutions, which was conspiring against the American people. And if you're part of this echo chamber, you would be told that then President Obama was colluding with a UK spy agency to spy on Mr. Trump. Mrs. Clinton was linked to a mysterious explosion that killed one of her employees. And the 2018 Florida school shooting was really a secret government operation. Foreign agents infiltrated, exploited this alt-right movement using fake social media accounts. They pretended to be real Americans, amplified the falsehoods that originated from these websites, targeted echo chambers with claims that Mrs. Clinton wanted to apply Sharia law in the US, that Mrs. Clinton was actively arming the terrorist group ISIS, that foreign agents also infiltrated other social media movements to spread falsehoods on both sides of the issues. They were agnostic about that and create more divisions. They amplified the falsehoods, they widened the divides, so the political ground became fragile, fraught, and conducive for foreign agents to operate. So the experiences of these two countries show that through a combination of falsehoods and digital technology, the foundations of democratic society are severely attacked. Falsehoods are used to undermine public trust, which is a cornerstone of our infrastructure of fact. They are used to divide and polarize, tearing the social fabric, and democratic discourse, accommodation, and compromise becomes very difficult. In these conditions, the political center becomes hollowed out and people are driven to extremes. If you take France, the Yellow Vest movement, at the center of the movement are these anger groups on Facebook. They are online hubs for falsehoods. They appeared almost a year before the street protests began in Paris. In the lead up to the protests, falsehoods were used, increased the sense that the system was failing and turning against the people. Various falsehoods that the French Constitution had been nullified in 2016 by the then Prime Minister, that President Macron was going to sign France's sovereignty away at a UN conference. 1 million Germans had protested increased fuel prices, that President Macron wrote to Paris police to use force against the protesters, and so on. And during the protests, misinformation in Yellow Vest Facebook groups and pages reached over 105 million views, 4 million shares in 5 months. Images were falsely captioned as bleeding Yellow Vest protesters. And then they were used to make the claim that media and government were hiding police brutality and violence against these protesters. So during the 2016 US presidential election, disinformation came from foreign operators. But in the midterm elections, such campaigns were more domestic. Americans were targeting other Americans using the same strategies that are said to have been introduced by the Russians. Sometimes activists work with foreign states. The Select Committee report has pointed out that state actors have formally coordinated with, co-opted other private sector actors, including private industry, civil society organizations, fringe movements, volunteers who ideologically support a cause. Select Committee report also mentioned an Asian country, didn't name it, is said to have an online cyber army and volunteers who promote the government's policies and attack those who criticize those policies. Social media has also enabled hate to thrive. Falsehoods are often centerpieces of hate propaganda, and over the past few years, people have used online falsehoods to promote an anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim prejudice. After the terrorist attack in Paris in 2015, a video was posted described as showing moderate Muslims celebrating the attack. It was actually a video of people celebrating a cricket match victory in Pakistan. But nearly 500,000 views within a few hours. Video was spread again after the terrorist attack in Paris in 2017 with the same false caption. The terror attack in Westminster in London in 2017, the slide is up, it became viral. It's a photograph of a Muslim woman walking past victims. She was on her phone, face hidden from view, falsely accused of ignoring the victims and treating the attack casually. Later discovered the tweet originated from a fake foreign account. When moderate Muslims demonstrated against terrorism in London, a false story was spread that the demonstration was staged, and in April this year, falsehoods were used to turn the Notre Dame fire into an anti-Muslim narrative. A fabricated quote ascribed to a Muslim US senator saying, "They reap what they sow." A video of Notre Dame burning with shouts of Allahu Akbar edited over. In Indonesia, a Muslim cyber army used falsehoods, hate speech, to inflame sentiments against gays, Chinese. We have also seen this in Germany, Italy, and Brazil, and all have rising populism, no coincidence. The psychological evidence is that mere exposure to conspiracy theories, even if they are dismissed, makes people less likely to accept official information or engage in politics. Conspiracy theories harm trust in institutions overall, not just the specific institutions that they relate to. And so people mistrust the very existence of an infrastructure of fact and disengage from public discourse altogether. So as William Davis said, when trust sinks beneath a certain point, many people may come to view the entire spectacle of politics and public life as a sham. So in the digital age, almost anyone can make a falsehood go viral or run a disinformation campaign. This happened in Sri Lanka. In India, child abduction rumors spread on WhatsApp, 69 mob attacks, 33 deaths. In Mexico, same child abduction rumors, horrific lynching of 2 men. This year in France, child abduction rumors targeting the Roma people led to several violent attacks on the Roma. Harm to public health when falsehoods are spread about healthcare. Financial markets can be affected very quickly. A false tweet that the White House had been bombed led to a massive fall in the stock market. So examples are innumerable. Every country this is happening. No one can disagree that this is a serious threat and that it has to be dealt with head on. I will say this to members of this House on both sides and the NMPs. If and when this happens in Singapore, there will be a deep damage to the institutions which are beyond and above politics. We are seeing this happen before our very eyes in other countries, which normally you could have assumed were stable, much more stable than Singapore, much bigger than Singapore. And if that happens, that will damage society beyond repair. So there is no benefit to anyone, regardless of any political persuasion. There is no benefit to see this happen because there is no benefit, whether political or otherwise, in seeing this happen for anyone. What are the tools that such actors use and what's the cost of such tools? The digital technology has given falsehoods a new power. The Select Committee found considerable evidence was given showing how modern digital technology has made the creation and dissemination of falsehoods easier, cheaper, more profitable, transforming it. I'll mention 3 tools: fake accounts, digital advertising, algorithms used by platforms to rank content. Fake accounts have been described as the foot soldiers of disinformation. They may be run either by humans, known as trolls, or may be automated, in which case they're called bots. Fake social media accounts manufactured to manipulate. Some of them cultivate persuasive online personas, gain followers, both real and fake, and used as fictitious leaders of public opinion using falsehoods to sway minds, create impressions of public sentiment. Bots are used to artificially amplify falsehoods, megaphone for falsehoods. They draw attention to falsehoods, affirm them, and make them appear to be more believable. Digital advertising tools are used to target falsehoods at susceptible segments of the population. Search engine results manipulated so that false articles are prioritized. Online echo chambers are created and exploited. Social media groups and online chats are used to polarize and mobilize people to orchestrate conflict. So falsehoods today travel easily and widely across multiple platforms. 2017, a news article that a Russian aircraft had managed to electronically disable a US warship. It was posted on a Russian state-controlled news site. Article used a parody that had been published a few years before and presented it as truth. You can see how it's not just the labels that matter. People can be made to believe that parody is in fact true. So need to look at the material objectively. So this slide, designed to glorify Russia, undermine confidence in the US Navy. In 2 days, it was picked up by mainstream outlets in the US and Europe. You can see how it spread. In less than 7 days, cross-posted on dozens of news sites and their social media pages, catered to different countries and demographics. Fox News version was shared over 27,000 times. Sun's version was shared over 10,000 times. So some of the most prominent examples in the last 3 years. 2016 Brexit. Research suggests that bots were generating up to 20% of Brexit-related tweets in the months leading to the referendum, including anti-Muslim falsehoods. In 2016 presidential elections, US Foreign Troll Factory conducted a disinformation campaign using 50,000 bot accounts, over 3,800 Twitter accounts, and at least 470 fake Facebook accounts. Facebook's best estimate from 2015 to 2017, approximately 126 million people may have received content from accounts associated with this troll factory. In the 2017 French presidential elections, emails from then-candidate Macron's campaign were hacked and leaked. So Macron leaks hashtag was used to guide Twitter users to false claims that the leaked emails showed evidence of illegal activity by Macron. Hashtag was then amplified through a network of trolls and bots reached 47,000 tweets in less than 4 hours after the initial tweet. Coordinated, inauthentic behavior by fake accounts was also seen in the US 2018 midterm elections, 2018 Brazilian presidential elections, the US anti-vaccine debate, and in Indonesia. Now, fake accounts have been used in very sophisticated ways. A Twitter account belonging to one Jenna Abrams was created in 2014. This appeared to belong to a young American woman. And once she built a following, she pushed a divisive set of views on immigration, Mr. Trump, especially closer to the 2016 elections. At one point, she had over 70,000 followers, quoted by dozens of high-profile media outlets, including the Washington Post, the BBC, and the New York Times, but turned out to be a fake account created by a foreign troll agency. The Twitter account impersonating the Tennessee Republican Party, also created by the same agency, spread falsehoods. President Obama had admitted he was Muslim. An employee of Clinton's was killed in a mysterious explosion in Washington, and Clinton was involved. At one point, it had over 152,000 followers. The real Tennessee Republican Party had less than 14,000 followers. So trolls, bots can and have been used in Singapore. We have noticed spikes in activity from inauthentic accounts when we have discussions on various issues of public concern. One example, whenever there is a bilateral issue with Malaysia, these go up. We recently estimated it went up by 30%. Such activity creates alternate realities. It manipulates perception, creates the impression that there are many voices, shouts down other viewpoints through fake accounts, shifts public opinion, erodes trust, and undermines institutions. If you turn to digital advertising, it is done to sway public opinion, used on both sides of the Atlantic. Foreign operatives were using it in a disinformation operation to influence the US elections. It was also used by the Vote Leave campaign in the UK. These tools allow messages to be micro-targeted with a high degree of precision at specific groups based on a variety of indicators, including people's fears and prejudices, able to do so because personal data of each user is harvested by platforms like Facebook. In the US, foreign operatives used $100,000 to spread Facebook advertisements to 126 million Americans. It's inexpensive compared with traditional advertising. And almost 2,000 ads used interest-based targeting, and of those, 800 were geographically targeted, including at swing states. And remember, in some swing states, the margin of victory was in the tens of thousands. In UK, the Vote Leave campaign spent more than £2.7 million on targeted advertisements. Targeted digital advertising was used in these campaigns because it was effective. Study by network theories showed when falsehoods are initially aimed at those predisposed to believe them, they spread further. Another troubling aspect of targeted advertising is it's hidden from public view. Others cannot see the falsehoods being spread. They are unable to step in and correct them. And again, as the British journalist Carolyn said in a TED talk, this entire referendum took place in darkness because it took place on Facebook. What happens on Facebook stays on Facebook because only you see your news feed and then it vanishes. So it's impossible to research anything. So we have no idea who saw what ads, what impact they had, what data was used to target these people, or even who placed the ads, how much money was spent, even what nationality they were. Third, the algorithms. They can play a big role in promoting falsehoods. Roger McNamee, who is an early investor and advisor to Facebook, said this about the 2016 US elections. Facebook's algorithms have played a huge role in this election cycle by limiting each member's news feed to things they like, which effectively prevents people from seeing posts that contradict their preconceptions. Trolls on both sides have exploited this bug to spread untruths and inflame passions. Platforms' algorithms have boosted conspiracy theories, false claims to the top of search results, recommendation lists, and newsfeed rankings. By giving them prominence, the falsehoods are made to seem more credible. Ranking does matter. One study found that manipulating search engine results to favor one candidate over another can alter voter preferences by 20%. This spread of falsehoods is also aided by service providers in a growing commercial disinformation industry. Cybersecurity firm Trend Micro gave evidence before the SC. So the going rates for tools and services, I've put it in your documents. It spreads falsehoods. 1 million Instagram likes, just pay $18 US. You can get 1 million likes. 100 Twitter followers, likes or retweets, 34 cents. 100 YouTube subscribers, 66 cents. Make a falsehood appear on a YouTube main page for 2 minutes, US $621. Make false content appear on legitimate news sites as if it's real costs a bit more, US $20,000. US online propaganda, to use online propaganda to instigate a street protest in the US, $200,000. But you can actually get a street protest. There are also hired guns who spread disinformation for their clients in return for a reward, a market opportunity. In Latin America, you have Andres Sepulveda, convicted of rigging elections throughout Latin America in return for payment from clients. And he used the cyberspace to spread falsehoods on key domestic issues and policies. Indonesian authorities uncovered one such syndicate, Sarakan Cyber Team, just one. There are so many of them. Next, who is misled by these falsehoods? 2018 survey by Ipsos, Global Independent Market Research Agency, on Singaporeans. 91% of Singaporean respondents could not correctly identify one or more of 5 false headlines presented to them. Falsehoods work. They work in a complex manner. They take advantage of the attention spans, mental shortcuts, cognitive biases of reasonable, rational people. So every day, all of us decide which issues to give our time and attention. A lot of information we come across, we make quick judgments based on who it comes from, how aligned it is with what we know and believe. These are the human loopholes that falsehoods seek to exploit. People's socio-political identities can play a key role in why people believe and share falsehoods. It's consistent with psychological studies on confirmation bias. So members can see from all of this, in the digital age, the conditions supporting a shared reality have fundamentally changed. From a main artery sustained by mainstream newspapers, public discourse is fragmenting into millions of social media groups and conversations. Mainstream media was likened by law professor Dr. Theo Lian to a public street. On this street, she said, and I quote, "You might encounter not only friends, but a variety of people engaged in a wide array of activities. In this system, people are made to see and show civility towards viewpoints they may not otherwise like and choose to see. But social media does the opposite. It is designed to connect people with who they want to be connected with, usually people they know or like, or who are like-minded, and they allow people to cut themselves off from the views and information they do not like." The Select Committee heard testimony from Dr. Hegelich and Mr. Sharazai. A political data scientist, Dr. Hegelich had advised German Chancellor Merkel. They described the use of social media for public discourse as an enormous misfit in design. On social media, communication is guided by private affinity and emotions. It is designed to be convenient, a world of likes, emoticons, memes, captions. But as Dr. Hegelich put it, and I quote, "Political discourse should not be convenient. In democracies, politics should be the result of debates which are often arduous because a compromise between legitimate interests has to be found. In the aftermath of the 2016 US elections, a group of academics from America's leading universities gathered to reflect on the problem of fake news. One of their key conclusions was this, and I quote, "Current social media systems provide a fertile ground for the spread of misinformation that is particularly dangerous for political debate in a democratic society." For those who favor politics of polarization, politics of misinformation, or one of cohesion and reason, these conditions are ideal. So let's move on. Can we expect self-regulation by tech companies? Tech companies play a key role in all of this. They provide the platform from which falsehoods and other content are spread. They have held themselves out as making the world a better place. Can they be relied upon to self-regulate? The evidence over the years shows clearly no. Sri Lanka, Facebook's years of inaction to hate speech is well documented. Last year, rumors led to ethnic violence, mosques were burned, people were attacked, state of emergency was declared. Facebook users lodged thousands of complaints over hate speech, and Facebook did nothing. One post, and I quote, only one of many such posts, "Kill all Muslims. Don't even let an infant of the dogs escape." In the midst of ongoing violence, what was Facebook's response to this? We have looked over the post. It doesn't go against one of our specific community standards. The Sri Lankan Communications Minister highlighted a tweet from this user as well. Last year in London, Edwin Tong questioned Facebook's representative on this post. I would like to show the video of that questioning. With your leave, sir.
If you just look at the page, it was then pointed out by a user, one of your users on Facebook, and subsequently picked up by one Harry Fernando, who was the communications minister of Sri Lanka at the time. Why is it that Facebook has refused to take it down?
The comment should be down. If it's not down, it should be. What I'm seeing in this is there are two possible reasons why the content was not taken down at the time. One is that it, simple error on the part of the person who looked at it.
Let me just stop you there. You go over the page of that second document, and you will see the response by Facebook when you were asked to take it down. And it says, "Thank you for the report. You did the right thing. You looked over the post. So it was no mistake, Mr. Allen." And it says, "It doesn't go against one of our specific community standards."
Yeah, that was a mistake. I just want to be clear that somebody has made a mistake in the review.
Mr. Allen, this is a very serious, egregious mistake. Would you agree?
I agree, yes.
It goes completely against your own policy.
Right.
To take down a group.
Can we rely on self-regulation? 2 weeks ago in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, terrorist bombings, more than 200 people killed. Terrorist leader had made videos to gain thousands of followers, called for attacks against other religious groups. It led to several previous attacks, but YouTube and Facebook removed the videos only after the Easter bombings. You see the slides with the photos of the victims. So what do we say to them? Sorry, we made a mistake. As Mr. Allen said to Edwin Tong, sorry, we made a mistake. Big tech have continuously refused to take down hate speech, ban groups promoting hate speech. As one American journalist put it, Facebook's world, Facebook's rules. The fact is that more users, more content on their platforms, the more user attention they can sell to advertisers, and the more they can profit. They are profit-making entities, ferocious. Will they voluntarily change their business model? They have also created a permissive online environment for hate. You saw what happened in New Zealand, and something similar happened just a week ago, copycat shooting in California, in the synagogue, where the whole thing was live-streamed. New Zealand, it was live-streamed. Here, it was live-streamed. Chair of the UK Digital Culture, Media and Sports Committee, Damien Collins, has said, it was a terror attack designed for social media, demonstrated why there had to be statutory regulation for social networks. Only now, Facebook has banned white nationalism from its platforms. In the 2016 US elections, 470 Facebook accounts used by foreign actors reached an estimated 126 million Americans. Facebook was questioned by the US Senate on whether they had plans to ban the purchase of ads using payments made in foreign currency. And Facebook would not give a straight answer. Last year, I asked the same question during the Select Committee hearings, and again, no straight answer. Twitter, 2 years after the US election, most of the accounts linked to foreign disinformation campaign were found to be still active. The recent Indonesian general elections, platforms helped disinformation spread. take root faster. In November 2016, Mr. Zuckerberg said it was a pretty crazy idea to think that fake news on Facebook had influenced the 2016 elections. 10 months later, when there was clear evidence of serious foreign interference, he apologized for having been dismissive. In November 2016, Facebook was questioned by the US Senate. It promised to do better, but said it would prefer to self-regulate. Recent release of internal EU Commission documents. Over the last 4 years, Facebook has pushed back against regulation, consistently said regulation will stifle innovation. To our select committee in March last year, they took the same line. Prescriptive legislation would make it harder for Facebook to find the right solutions. So what right solutions have they found? In March this year, 1 day before we tabled this bill in Parliament, Mr. Zuckerberg said, regulation against harmful content is needed. Problem is too big for them to handle. That is what we are now doing. Facebook made this concession because it had no choice. In February 2018, a UK parliamentary committee questioned Facebook on whether it had provided user data to Cambridge Analytica, which had used data mining to help political candidates and groups target potential voters. Mr. Milner, Facebook's representative, said to the UK Parliament Facebook had not provided such user data to Cambridge Analytica, did not disclose that the user data had been taken by Cambridge Analytica, and that he knew of it at the time. I questioned Mr. Milner about this during the SE hearing. He then conceded he should have given a more frank answer to the UK committee. Agreed that a reasonable person could take the view that he had not been full and frank in his answers and had misled the UK committee. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Ms. Ardern, has said, we cannot simply sit back, accept that these platforms just exist, and what is said on them is not the responsibility of the place where they are published. It cannot be a case of all profit and no responsibility. I also read NMP Sun Sun's op-ed on this point. Her view is that government, big tech, and consumers should come together and work in a tripartite fashion, rather than relying on legislation alone. Fair point. I have said on this subject as well as on other subjects, legislation provides a framework. By itself, legislation cannot achieve all the needed objectives. A lot of cooperation is needed. Tech companies are not our enemies. They are our partners. We want them to succeed. We want them to do well in Singapore and elsewhere, and we must work with them to solve problems. But at the same time, we need to be quite clear about the dynamics. They are focused on profit. And there is little incentive for them to do things which will affect their profits. In Singapore, they must know, we must make sure they know, there is public interest. They can make profit, but not at the expense of Singaporeans. And POHA and POFMA seek to provide that framework. And they know Singapore government cannot be bought. We don't take money from their lobbyists, and we mean what they say. They can do business with us honorably. Singapore provides a proper rule of law framework for everyone, but they must also be responsible. Last year's SC proceedings and their dealings with us would have left them in no doubt that we can push back when necessary. And throughout this period, we have had constructive discussions with them. But let me give members some recent example. On the 4th of May, last Saturday, the managing director of AIC, Jeff Payne, published an op-ed. AIC is a lobby group for tech companies, and his op-ed was full of basic errors. One of the points he made, he referred to clause 61, the exemption clause, and said this was troubling. This clause gives the power to exempt and really will help tech companies, because where they cannot comply and they can show reasonable reasons why they cannot comply, exemptions can be given. So since they said this, and we had been discussing in general how we can help tech companies when they cannot comply, I asked my ministry to tell the companies, and that was on Monday because op-ed came out on Saturday, yesterday. I told my ministry officials to tell the tech companies. You don't think this clause is necessary, right? Okay, I'm quite happy to remove it. I'm speaking in Parliament on Tuesday, and if I don't get any response before I speak, I will assume that tech companies do not want this clause. Because how do I tell the members of this Parliament that this is primarily to help tech companies when they themselves say they do not want it? What was the response? It was quite swift. Last night, AIC issued a statement. They said they appreciated SMS Edwin Tong's clarification on the exemption clause, and they appreciated government's efforts to make POFMA technically feasible for tech companies. That's what they need to see from us. These are not children's games. This is serious business. Tech companies will say many things to try and advocate their position. We have to show them we are fair, but also firm. And then they will deal with us in a business-like way. There cannot be, and I don't think there is, any serious dispute that legislation is necessary. The question is, what sort of legislation? This bill is based on the SE report, which explains what outcomes should be achieved. Bill seeks to achieve those outcomes. We think the setting out in the bill will best achieve the outcomes the Select Committee had identified. SMS Edwin Tong will go through the specific provisions. I will now deal with some of the criticisms of this bill. Ms. Han Yong Mei had a good commentary in Chapao some weeks back. She said, 1, there is nothing wrong with questioning whether the powers under POFMA will be abused. 2, but people should first read the bill in detail. This is part of responsible speech. And if they did, they would understand that certain things people have been saying about it are untrue. 3, at the same time, she had a piece of advice for the government. Please understand that some people may be genuinely concerned and don't see shadows and treat them as being purely antagonistic. I think fair points. The following are some of the points that have been made about the bill. 1, it gives too much power to the government. 2, it will have a chilling effect on free speech. That phrase again. 3, definition of fact and opinion is not clear. 4, definition of public interest is too wide. 5, difficult to challenge the minister's decision. Let me deal with each. I explained to members earlier, the bill is narrower in terms than the current law. The power this bill gives to a minister is, minister declares that an article contains falsehoods, asks for a correction order to be carried, or in some cases, take down. It's open to challenge in court. If minister is wrong, he gets overruled. And this inaccurate claim is then sought to be backed up by a series of other inaccurate claims. 1, it creates a new crime. Spreading of falsehoods is a new crime. That's quite inaccurate. It already exists under Section 45 of the Telecoms Act, now under the MOA, and applies to the Internet. TA criminalizes falsehoods. Bill covers the same ground, falsehoods. But in terms of intent, it requires the person to have known or had reason to know not only that it was false, but also that spreading it was likely to prejudice public interest. So in fact, there are 2 requirements for knowledge, and both requirements have to be satisfied, even though it's based on a reason of having to know. Whereas under the TA, it's just sending out of falsehoods. Second, it's often said recourse to judicial review is not available under the bill. Short answer, wrong. Third, judge cannot examine the proportionality of a direction. Wrong. Power in clause 61 of the bill to exempt certain persons from the act can be used for some unstated sinister purpose. This exemption power is a common provision in many pieces of legislation. It's found in the Executive Condominium Housing Schemes Act, Postal Services Act, Active Mobility Act, Dangerous Fireworks Act, wide variety of laws. Explained, for example, where it's not possible to comply with the Act due to reasons such as technical impossibility, then you could rely on this. Next, some academics have said truth is relative impossible to state what is fact as opposed to what is false and misleading, and this will affect academic work. Minister Ong Ye Kung will respond on matters specific to academia. I will just say this. Their concerns appear to be expressed without an understanding of the existing legal position, how this bill fits in, and not sure how many of them are aware of the BA, the TA, the MOA, and other legislation. Just give you a couple of examples. A law lecturer signed the letter. Did he know the current legal position? Another signatory in a recent interview with Civicus, an international NGO, made several completely erroneous statements. He said the bill defines a falsehood tautologically such that any government minister can define a statement as false based on public interest. These are two different and conjunctive requirements. You have to show it's a false statement of fact, and you have to show it affects public interest. He unfortunately seems to conflate the two and says if it is contrary to public interest, then we can declare it as false. Of course, you believe that, then you will get very worried. So I read the interview more than once to try and see whether that's what he really meant, but that's what the words say. It's very odd, a fairly fundamental error, and if that's what the bill states, it will be quite illogical, because it's false because public interest is involved. If a Singaporean academic can be mistaken on such a basic point or set of points, then it's understandable that foreign academics could have signed without an understanding or appreciation of the true position. As I've said, laws that target false statements of fact have been around for a long time. Meanwhile, in the last 15 years of the Times World Rankings, NUS went from 18 to 8, and NTU went from 50 to 12. There is no legal or logical basis for the concerns that this bill will stifle academic research specifically. As I said, Minister Ong will respond later on some points. Then it has been said, why not define fact and state that opinion is not covered? We considered this carefully and decided better not. There is a body of case law on what is fact and what is not fact. It's better to rely on existing case law. When there is a dispute, the matter can be dealt with by the courts. So how else do you decide? Next, chilling effect. I think this must be one of the most overused phrases. Free speech should not be affected by this bill. We are talking here about falsehoods, we are talking about bots, we are talking about trolls, we are talking about fake accounts, and so on. Prof. Theo Lien gave evidence during the Select Committee hearings on the ambit of free speech and whether falsehoods were free speech. She made the following points. Not all forms of speech are worthy of equal protection. For example, if you falsely cry fire in a crowded theatre, that's not protected as valuable speech. UK House of Lords judgment, there is no human right to disseminate information that is not true. No public interest is served by communicating misinformation. The working of a democratic society depends on the members of that society being informed and not misinformed. Misleading people, purveying facts as statements which are not true is purveying as facts statements which are not true is destructive of the democratic society. Where speech does not serve the justifications for free speech by harming the search for truth or by preventing citizens from becoming informed on issues, that does not warrant protection. Next, definition of public interest is too wide. It's important to remember that the bill does not cover statements just because they are against public interest. Those statements must be false statements of fact in the first place. Some have said the definition of what is in the public interest is too wide and that it should not include Clause 4F, which relates to the diminution of public confidence in the functions of government institutions. I have explained earlier in some detail, maybe too considerable a detail, how online falsehoods seek to break down trust by attacking institutions. It is important to protect institutions from falsehoods. And if you look at the point I made many times. You look at the current definition and you look at the existing definition and decide for yourself which is wider. And then it is said it's difficult to challenge a minister's decision. I have previously said the process that will be in place, it will be fast, it will be simplified to allow individuals to appear and present arguments on whether it is true or false. The detailed procedure will be in subsidiary legislation, and that's usual, but I will set out an overview of the process. First, an aggrieved person must apply to the minister to cancel a direction. This is consistent with the usual position of exhausting administrative remedies before resorting to the courts. We will provide a standard form online for aggrieved persons to use. Form must be sent to an email address which will be set out in the direction, and the relevant minister must make a decision no later than 2 days after the form is received, excluding non-working days. The appeal to court will be similarly quick. The appeal will have to be filed no later than 14 days. This is up to the applicant. He can file the very next day if he wants, after the minister decides on the application to cancel the direction. Simple standard forms will be provided for the appeal documents that an appellant can fill out and file in the courts. The courts will be asked to fix the hearing within 6 days of an application being filed. The appellant must attend before the duty registrar to request for an expedited hearing, again in the manner prescribed by the rules of court. Documents will need to be served on the minister no later than the next day. Again, an email address will be provided for the appellant to serve the documents on the minister to make it easy for him. So minister must then file his or her reply in court no later than 3 days after the documents are served as prescribed. As stated earlier, meanwhile, the court would have already fixed the hearing no later than 6 days after the date on which the court first receives the application. So to summarize, a person aggrieved by a direction will have the opportunity to have his or her case heard in the High Court as early as 9 days after he initiates a challenge by writing to the minister. So this includes the time the minister responds, the time for filing, the time for him to file, and the time for the minister to respond, and the hearing, beginning to end. If he moves very fast, it can be 9 days. They will have to be working days. The court will continue, of course, to have a general discretion to extend timelines where there is good reason to do so. How long the hearing takes and how long the court takes to decide are matters for the courts. Parliament and the executive cannot intervene in that. We can say when it should be heard. We cannot say when it should be decided. Court fees will be kept very low for individuals. No hearing fees will be charged for the first 3 days. Further days of hearing will be charged at usual rate, but even then the court will have power to waive fees. But this should not be taken as a license to abuse the process. Courts will still have the power to deal with parties in the usual manner, including how they conduct themselves. Professor Eugene Tan of SMU suggested we use illustrations during the second reading to explain the difference between fact and opinion. Good suggestion. So I asked for some illustrations from groups we met, students from NUS, and academics. The list is enclosed and circulated to all members and will form part of the record. I'll refer to some additional examples. A professor of law states that the death penalty in Singapore does not deter crime, as shown by several studies. These studies present real data. That's a conclusion drawn from studies. It's a statement of opinion not covered by the bill. But if that professor refers to a non-existent study or non-existent data, then it's a false statement of fact. This is drawn from a recent incident and was one of the illustrations submitted. A person, say A, states that government is showing double standards by having 2 different permit regimes to govern public activist events on political issues on the one hand, and a public meetup by an influencer on the other. It is true that two different permit regimes apply to the two different kinds of events, and therefore A's statement is an opinion and is not covered by the bill. However, if A says or implies that the same permit rules govern both kinds of events and double standards were applied for the granting of permits, essentially suggesting bias, based on the point that the same legislation and rules applies for both, that's a false statement of fact. It can be covered by the bill. The remedy would usually be a clarification. Form of clarification will be set out in subsidiary legislation, basically a link to where the clarification can be found with a statement that the article contains inaccuracies or is false, and reference giving to the link to the true facts. And people can read the truth of both documents and decide for themselves. It actually encourages a more honest and more open discussion. Another illustration, an economist states that the home ownership rate in Singapore is only 9% and explains that the definition of home ownership used excludes any lease, regardless of whether the lease is 9 years or 99 years. That's a conclusion based on a certain methodology. He says that, and he sets it out. It's not covered by the bill. Government can, of course, disagree with that view. But if, however, the economist says the number of persons who own freehold property in Singapore is X, when it's actually Y, then that's a false statement of fact. Another illustration, B publishes an online article stating that social welfare system in Singapore has gaps. That conclusion is drawn from interviews with government officials and social workers. Government can disagree with the conclusion, but it doesn't come within the bill. If, however, B's article says the welfare assistance had been denied to a needy elderly person when assistance had in fact been given, then it's a false statement of fact. So members can see it. These we are talking about very clear. It will be clear when you look at examples. If public interest is affected, then it can come under the bill. In all of these, it's not enough to show it's false. It must also be affecting public interest. This is a situation where, again, the original article can carry a clarification. I'll use another recent incident to illustrate. In the case relating to Mr. Nicholas Lim, there were questions as to why he was not charged. The police investigated the case, gave a conditional warning. Some made allegations that Mr. Lim was not prosecuted because his parents were influential. That was false. Father was a driver in the public transport sector, mother a housewife. So the illustrations, once you look at them, I think are quite clear. Courts have long dealt with this. It really ought not to be an issue. And we have had this legislation in the books forever. Next, let me turn to the notice of amendment put by the NMPs. I think it's useful for me to set out our views on the NOA. As I've said elsewhere, there is substantial agreement between the NMPs and us on the major points of the bill. The differences we have on the directions regime are mainly on matters of process. And they've made 4 proposals. First, the 3 NMPs have proposed that the directions provide more specific reasons on falsity and public interest. I agree with the principle underpinning the first part of this proposal. The government, when it says something is false, must obviously set out the reasons why it is false. And we intend to set this out in subsidiary legislation. When the directions are given, there must be a statement as to why it is false. And this was intended all along. The legislation is specifically designed for this purpose. Clause 13.4 allows for subsidiary legislation to be made to set out the requirements for directions. Question of operationalization. When a minister issues a direction, what kind of information should be contained in the direction? Why something is false, I've explained, should be explained in the direction. What should be the level of detail? I think it's difficult to set out up front. It must be left in each case. What extent of detail should be specified? And it's really more appropriate to use subsidiary legislation to set out the requirements. And subsidiary legislation is law, and it's public, and it's transparent, and it's open to scrutiny. Separately, on public interest, again, I'm not comfortable requiring a setting out of detailed reasons on how a particular course of action serves public interest. The level of detail depends on each case. It's difficult for Parliament today to envisage what are the types of cases. How are you even going to start setting out what level of detail ought to be set out? You don't even know what the case is about. But you must set out enough detail, and if not, you take the risk of a court challenge, and then you go and explain to the judge. If there is a challenge, the government will have to show public interest, and will have to explain in court why the information it provided is adequate, and depends on whether the court accepts the explanation. So that's the best way of dealing with these things. You cannot go up front and try to legislate every detail. Second proposal is to set out in the primary legislation that appeals to the minister must be adjudicated without delay. I agree with the policy. It's just a difference on how it should be implemented. Timelines are usually set out in the subsidy legislation, and I have set out what the timelines are that we are going to put in place. And these will be in law by way of subsidy legislation. And we are going further than what the three NMPs have proposed. Their amendment proposes the minister, and I quote, shall do everything reasonable to ensure that appeals to the minister are adjudicated without delay. I again quote, High Court hearings shall commence as soon as practicable and that costs to the appellant are minimized. Assuming you put these broad principles in legislation without any specifics, what is as soon as practicable and what is without delay? Court hearings today can take anything between 12 to 18 months, sometimes longer. So if we had it in 6 months, is that as soon as practicable? Obviously so. So really one should avoid this sort of imprecise language in legislation, because minister shall respond as soon as practicable. Is that 12 days? Is that 14 days? Is that 30 days? How are you going to challenge? How are you going to say, well, you know, it takes 6 months for the hearing to take place? The short answer to that will be, well, you know, it's as soon as practicable compared with the fact that it takes 18 months now. You really don't want to go into that territory. What you want are precise timelines, the kind of timelines I have given. From the time you send a notice to the minister to the time you are in court, very precise. If you get your act together, 9 days. Much clearer. So I really do not think, I mean, this is I'm arguing against the government being given more time. I don't think it is good enough simply to say do everything reasonable to decide quickly. You must mandate that the minister decides within a certain time period. And it's not enough for the High Court hearings to commence as soon as practicable. We should set out when the hearing should start. The third proposal made by the NMPs is a proposal to insert key principles into the Act. The three NMPs want to insert certain principles. I appreciate the intent underpinning the proposal. But frankly, without any disrespect, some of the proposals are unworkable and some others are unsuitable for primary legislation. I can understand they are not lawyers, so let me just take them through. If you look at para A, it covers the importance of critical thinking to a democracy. Principle is important. It's acknowledged by the Select Committee in recommendations 1 and 2. And it's one of the tools that supports the development of a well-informed public. But it really, you need legislation at the same time, and you've got to have legislation work with non-legislative measures. But in the kind of situations we are talking about, there is no question whatsoever that legislation is essential. And this bill is about legislation. Separately, the government has committed to a whole series of non-legislative matters. And Parliament can question the different ministries, ranging from education to public education to media literacy, there are a variety of things. But when there is public interest involved and there is falsehood, the NMPs accept the bill is necessary. Then there can be no argument that the bill has to be used, or the powers under the Act has got to be used. And it's necessary then to push out the facts to the public by way of correction, to inoculate them against a falsehood. Evidence is set out in the Select Committee report. You look at paragraphs 390 to 396 and 425. So you do not get much by adding this to the legislation. We've got to be very clear. The legislation is for this purpose. Then there are a group of, I think, proposals which target, it's a sort of negative list, about when statements are not false and when statements are not statements of fact. You want the principles in. I understand the intent. It's to try and clarify matters. But if you look at your proposals B and C, they essentially relate to the process of establishing truth and falsehood. As I have said, have a care. There is an entire body of law in this area. The law of evidence is there to deal with the question of how facts should be established. The question of how truth or falsity should be established. And it should draw from the body of principles that form part of case law. And really, it would not serve the rigor of this process to point out some but not the others. When you go and start putting this thing in, you run the risk of, trying to take out or deal with some parts of an existing body of law. And the courts will deal with it where necessary. Similarly, on principle G, I have already explained why it is preferable to rely on the existing case law. Right? The third group of statements proposed are D, E, and F, and they essentially relate to proportionality. E and F, proportionality is already incorporated into the requirements under the bill, and it is stronger than your proposal because when it's incorporated in the bill, it is part of the legal requirement. Yours are only statements of principles. This is already in the law. So the legal test already requires that the power can only be exercised when it's necessary or expedient in the public interest to do so. The government has gone one step further, perhaps more than one step further than what you have proposed. Finally, principle D. The bill only deals with situations where there's a falsehood which affects public interest. So it would not make sense to suggest that we insist upon non-legislative measures when public interest is at stake, because there's a need to respond quickly to counteract the damage. So does that mean, by putting this in, that you don't ask for corrections? And I caution you, it can lead to endless litigation, because let's say the minister seeks to act under the bill, and that is the principle here. Then it can be argued, well, in this case you shouldn't act because it's not necessary, you can take non-legislative measures. Someone argues that. It may fail, but that can take months. It can create a fair bit of confusion as well. So we should just be very clear what the bill provides, what is the framework for the bill, and try not to over-egg the pudding. We run more risks that way. We should have a robust debate here, explain what the bill is all about, have it as a matter of record in the Hansard, and that is used by the courts as a matter of interpretation. So the NMP is concerned about enshrining principles in a manner which will bind future governments. I think really it's best served by the debate and by the courts serving as an oversight mechanism and provisions in future, interpreting the provisions in future. But a future government can always amend. So that's a separate point, right? Finally, there is a proposal for an independent counsel, the Fourth Amendment. I understand the intent again is a good faith attempt to ensure that the conversation on this important issue continues, both on the nature of the problem and how the legislation is implemented. Government agrees that these conversations should continue. The question is establishing another council the best way? And would it lead to unnecessary bureaucratic bloat? All of the functions of this council can be achieved under the current structure of the executive and parliament. On accountability, ministers, executive, are responsible to members of this House, to Parliament. Every time there is an exercise of power, which seems to you to be not clear, you ask questions. You just look at the questions that have been filed since you became MPs. Every major issue, anything that happens from NUS to other areas, you don't need to wait for 1 year. It's raised immediately, and answers are given. I remember I said about authenticity. Singapore public must know this institution works, and if there is a question, it will be answered, and there's got to be the trust as well, and where the trust is not merited, that's got to be exposed as well. And the best way is really, Parliament is a representative body. It's meant to work in a democracy in this way, where MPs hold the ministers accountable and check and ask questions. You don't keep creating bodies, and then who checks on them? So it's really more effective to rely on the strength of our current institutions, direct accountability, and together with accountability to the courts. So you have Parliament, you have the courts. What more do you want? Anytime there is a question, can be challenged in courts, can be challenged in Parliament. You keep getting it wrong, the electorate will have something to say about it. So I think I've covered most of the major arguments. I've set out the nature, the philosophical reasons for the bill at some length, perhaps too considerable a length, for which I apologize. But with that, sir, I beg to move.